Welcome everyone to our 23rd class in this series on the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noyach, that we are currently studying a section in the S'dei Chemed encyclopedia, which in the standard set is volume Ches 8, and Klolim Mareches Agimel Simin Vav, which the entry is Goy. It's in alphabetical order. So section 6 here is all about non-Jews, B'nai Noyach. And we are now up to subsection 21, which would bring us to page Aleph Taf Reish Yud Gimel, 1613. Otherwise, it's the page that's on the left-hand side, opposite page 3224. So again, in the Hebrew, the pagation would be Aleph Taf Reish Yud Gimel, and otherwise it's the page in between 3224 and 3226. In the middle of the right-hand column, where you have the Chaf Aleph, which is 21. And as we mentioned in practically all of the classes in this series, the S'dei Chemed here is taking Jewish concepts in Jewish law and bringing down various different opinions as to whether or not, and if they do, how and when do they apply to the B'nai Noyach. So right now, 21 is short, and none of the remaining ones, it goes all the way through 31, are too long, as we had some of the previous ones. A couple of them were extremely long. So let us begin inside. Just by way of a brief introduction for this one, for 21, we've discussed previously that in Jewish law, for the Jewish people, in order for the Jewish court, the Beis Din, to administer the death penalty, so the Jewish court, in the times when they were allowed to, nowadays they can't, but in the days when they were allowed to, when they were able to, the court had to consist of at least 23 members. That's not the Supreme Court, which is 71, but 23 members, and every city in the land of Israel, ideally, was supposed to have a Beis Din, a Jewish court, of at least 23 members. Less than 23 cannot put a person to death. That does not apply to B'nai Noyach. Another point, in order for a Jew to be able to receive any punishment, there have to be two proper, acceptable witnesses. By B'nai Noyach, that's not the case either. So now, let's see this piece inside. Eid, im nase dayon leven Noyach. There's a concept in Jewish law whether or not a witness can become the judge in the same case. What do you do if a judge witnessed a crime, a sin? Can he then be the judge of that case? So, in Jewish law, for the Jewish people, if it's a capital offense, so we have the rule that ein eid nasa dayan, which translated means that the witness cannot become the judge. Doesn't work that way. So it happens to be that out of the 23 members of the Jewish court, two of these very righteous and very learned and very God-fearing people witnessed someone transgress, and they gave him a proper warning with all the details, they cannot sit on the bench of that court as judges. Unacceptable. Well, what about by Bnei Noach? How does that work? Hine hagoin meloy haroim b'mareches ben Noach loistalut kosav b'shem harav Yudei Moshe b'Bereishis Rabba Parsha Lamed Dalet. So he brings down what one of the commentators says in the name of someone else, on his commentary to the Midrash Rabbah, the aid, that a witness, Shira'a, that saw something, he witnessed something, Nasa Dayan, indeed he does become the judge, V'hargoy, and he kills him. This witness judges the case himself and puts to death the person who transgressed. So, simply put, according to this opinion, if a Ben Noach saw another Ben Noach transgress one of the 7 Noachite commandments, so this person who witnessed it would be the one who right away can judge the case and put that person to death. V'hu kasav al dvarav, but then the Meloy Haroyim, which is the one who's quoting the Yedei Moshe, he wrote about that. Deloy Dok, that is not precise. He says he was not meticulous enough. The davkaim shnayim ra'u. You have to be more specific, he says. And it's specifically if 2 people saw, 2 people witnessed, Yochel echad leheyasa istayon. So one of the 2 can then play the role of the judge, Vasheni yoid, and the other witness will be the witness. Because again, for Bnei Noach, all you need is 1 witness. But you can't have a case, says the Muloi Haroyim, where 1 single individual witnessed a case and now he judges the case and puts him to death. No, that can't be. If you have 2 people that witnessed it, so one of them can be the judge while the other one then testifies, and then the judge will put him to death based on the testimony. Because the Ben Noach can be put to death based on 1 witness and also based on 1 judge. However, if only 1 witnessed it, then we say the rule, using the terminology that we use for the Jewish people, that ein eid nasa dayan, that the witness cannot become the judge. All right. That pretty much sums up that whole discussion. Now we move on to the next piece rather. Chaf Beis 22. Some of what we're going to discuss now in this next piece, we have discussed it or touched upon it in previous classes. And some of which we're going to say now is actually very relevant this coming Jewish year. The coming Jewish year is Taf Shin Pei Beis, or Hey Taf Shin Pei Beis, 5782. 5782 is a Shemitah year, a sabbatical year. And the non-Jew can play a very crucial role in that Shemitah year, which we'll soon discuss. Although that's not the discussion here, but it lends itself or can lead into that. So first, let's see what he says over here. So we're in the middle of the right-hand column on page Aleph Taf Resh Yud Gimel, Chaf Beis. Ma shenistapakta, that which you are in doubt. I hefkerei shel benoyach mahani, whether the hefker, the denouncing ownership of a ben noyach, does that help? Does that work? Now, again, we discussed the concept of hefker in an earlier class. Hefker is when an owner takes his property and declares it ownerless. So he gave up ownership. He didn't sell it to anyone. He didn't give it as a gift to anyone. He removed his ownership. And now that property, whether it's real estate, such as a field or a house, or whether it's a movable object, such as an animal or a garment, when he's mafkir it, when he makes this announcement, it is now ownerless, and first come, first serve, as they say. Person comes and claims it, it's that person's. Now, does that work by a ben noyach as well? Can he be mafkir his property? So he says like this, Mishnah Shleimahi. This is an explicit Mishnah. Now, just to remind you, in general, what we call the Torah, I don't want to say the Bible, the law, the God-given Torah that he gave the Jewish people, which includes in it the laws and the message for the Bnei Noyach, for the non-Jewish world. And this was the revelation at Sinai in the year 2448 from creation. And what's most famous is that we heard the 10 commandments from God. Moses was on the mountain, 40 days, 40 nights, received the law. In general, the Torah is divided into two parts. The written Torah and the oral Torah. The written is the scroll that Moses wrote and completed actually on the day of his demise. 13 scrolls, one for every tribe, and one that went into the Holy Ark in the tabernacle. And then, as the prophets came along throughout the generations, beginning with the book of Yeshua, Joshua, then the book of Shoftim, Judges. So we have the prophets, and then we have Ksuvim, the writings of the scripture. In total, we have the 24 books which comprise the Tanakh, which some call, I'm not going to use the term, some call the Old Testament, but I'm not going to say that. The Tanakh. So we have Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, the prophets, Kesuvim, the scriptures. That is the written law. Along with the written law, God explained to Moses, to Moshe, the meaning of all of these commandments. So it's almost, let's simplify it, and the written law is sometimes cryptic. It's almost like just hints or highlighted headlines or whatever, some people in the world of academia, I guess, it's known, a lot of people would write their cliff notes. It's something like that. But all the details are in the oral law. And we've discussed this a number of times in previous classes. And we've challenged anyone to find any one of the 613 commandments that can be fully and completely and properly understood in all of its details just from the written law. Impossible. Some more, some less. Impossible. You'd be making up stuff. I could give you 613 examples. Let me just pick a couple. Shabbos. To rest on Sabbath. When does Shabbos begin biblically? When does Shabbos end? What exactly is forbidden to do on Shabbos? So in English, you may tell me some word like work or labor. What does that mean? And if you know the original language and you know the Torah in its original, so then you're learned and you're going to tell me the word milacha. Thank you. What does that mean? Milacha? Work, labor. So we need the oral tradition, and not to be confused with all of the many things that are rabbinic. I'm talking biblically. What did God tell Moses? And then he transmitted it to the next and the next and the next, and so on. So how to properly observe and keep the Shabbos and rest, and I say that word in quotations, on Shabbos, that we only know from the oral law. Another example. Tefillin, phylacteries. What in the world are we supposed to tie and wear? Oh yes, the verse says, tie them on your hand, and they shall be for, as they made up in the English translation, frontlets, whatever that means, between your eyes. There are so many details. From that verse itself, you have no idea how to perform the mitzvah. And the list goes on and on. 613, as I said. So for that we have the oral law. So the oral law is the oral explanation and tradition of how we are to understand and interpret the written. Fast forward many generations, and this is post the destruction of the Second Temple. Came along the leader of the generation then, known as Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who he had a very, very prestigious lineage. He himself in his own right was the leader of the Jewish people. And he, along with his court, decided that they had to do something which otherwise is not allowed in order to save the Torah from being forgotten. And I'm giving it to you very, very briefly. That's basically where it came along, and he wrote the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the oral law that was written. And he divided up into 6 orders, 6 very general topics, and each order has masechtos, which in English they translate as tractates. Every tractate has chapters, and every chapter has paragraphs which are called Mishnah. Thus, the whole thing is called Mishnah. So Mishnah is the first original writing of the oral law. And then came all the explanations to it and all the different debates and all the things around it. And that's what's known as Gemara, and the whole thing together is known as Talmud. Talmud. Now, there's a Mishnah, which means this is the oral law as it is now written. And that Mishnah is in Reish Perek Daled de Peah Mishnah Tes. In the tractate of Peah, Peah speaks about laws of gifts for the poor that a Jew is obligated to give from his field in the land of Israel. So a Jew who owns a field is not permitted to harvest 100% of the field and take it for himself to either eat or sell or whatever. He must leave a certain section for the poor people to take. Not to be confused with tithing it. Similar, but this is not the commandment, this is not the mitzvah of tithing. So, in that tractate, which is called Peah, chapter 4, Mishnah 9, it says, V'aleket, v'ashichicha, v'apeya degoy, chayav b'maisros. Now, Meiser is tithing. So let's go back to the simple understanding of the laws, how they apply to a Jew. A Jew is obligated to give 10% of the produce of his field to, well, it depends on the year, but basically he has to give it away, either to the poor or to someone from the Levite tribe. He has to give it away. Now, the part that he leaves for the poor, which is known, it's three things, leket, shikha, and peah. It's either some of the parts that fall as he's harvesting it, or if he forgot something in the field. And peah is when he leaves over an edge. At the end of the field, he leaves over a part that is unharvested for the poor to take. Those parts of the produce of the field, he doesn't have to tithe because it's not his. He fulfilled the commandment, the biblical commandment of leaving it for the poor. So he doesn't have to tithe that. He tithes the remainder of the field, whatever he did not leave as leket, shikha, and peah. Now, what happens if a non-Jew, a goy, who's not obligated to give leket, shikha, and peah, but if he decides to voluntarily fulfill the mitzvah of leket, shikha, and peah? As we know, which is a whole discussion for itself, there are certain commandments, certain mitzvahs, that if a goy wishes to fulfill, he may. And then you have those that he's not permitted to. Leket, shikha, and peah falls into the category that the non-Jew is permitted to do. So this Mishnah tells us that the leket, shikha, and peah, that the non-Jew voluntarily left for the poor, chayav b'maisros. One does need to give 10%. Besides leaving it, you do have to give 10% away. Ela im kain Hefker, unless the non-Jew didn't just say, I'm leaving over from my field the edge for the poor. But unless he did it a little bit differently than the way that the Jew normally does it. And that is that he made it ownerless. He made a declaration that I am not the owner of that. Once he did that, then of course, it is exempt from the tithe. Now, Ulamanda Amar, Ein Kinyan L'goy Beretz Yisrael, Lahafkia. However, what about according to the opinion in the Talmud that says that a non-Jew can't and doesn't have ownership in any of the land of Israel in order to remove the various different obligations from giving away any of the tithes, etc. So Muki beGemara Gitin Daf Mem Ches. So we establish in the Talmud, tractate Gittin, page 48, the Mayri Besada the Goy Ulakitnu Yisrael. We're talking about that the field belongs to the non-Jew, and the one who's gathering it is a Jew. Alma, so what do we see from this discussion? The Goy imifkiroi patur mimaiser. That if a non-Jew disowns something, then that piece of land or that produce indeed does not need to be tithed. So we see that there is the concept of a non-Jew being able to make something hefker, making it ownerless. We see a big difference here. If he didn't, then you still have to tithe it. Unlike the Jews, leket, shikha, and peah. But if the non-Jew did make it hefker, ownerless, then you don't have to tithe it. V'chein pirish harambam v'harav mishnah zoy. And indeed, this is how the Rambam Maimonides and the Rav, otherwise known as the Bar Tenura, Rabbi Ovadia mi Bar Tenura, this is how, in their commentary on the Mishnah, explain this Mishnah. Achein, however, yesh lisapik, but there is room for us to question, to doubt, beifkiroi goy, if a goy indeed did make it ownerless, imatzi lachzor, is he able to retract terem da'asu liyad hazoiche, before it comes to the hand of the one who takes ownership of it? Meaning, the guy, the Ben Noyach, made a declaration, made an announcement that this property is not his, it's ownerless. And before anyone came to take ownership of it, the owner, the original owner, the non-Jew, he says, I changed my mind. I am retracting. Does that work? Can he? According to what I explained elsewhere, that which the retraction of the original owner who made it ownerless does not work, he cannot retract, and the original owner who made it ownerless cannot reclaim it, unless he took ownership by doing a legal act of acquisition, like any other foreign person, anyone besides himself, would need to do. So if somebody owns something and they declare it hefker, ownerless, you can't just have someone else say, okay, I call it, it's mine. This is not some childish game, up for grabs, down for keeps, or all these, things that kids do. This is a very serious, legal transaction. So when someone makes his property ownerless, in order for someone else to become the rightful owner, they have to do an act of acquisition. So too, if the person himself who made it ownerless wants to now, quote unquote, retract, he needs to do an act of acquiring it, and then that's fine. Then he's the one who took ownership of it. He is the, quote unquote, new owner. Because verbal speech does not have the legal power to undo verbal speech. So to make it hefker, to make it ownerless, all he had to do was say words. As soon as he says, this and this property of mine is hefker, it became hefker. Just with his words. But words don't have the power to undo, to cancel those words that made it hefker. Now, why not? What's the explanation to that law? Du mitam neder. The reason is because it falls into the category of a vow. And once a person makes a vow, in order to retract or undo it, can't just say, just kidding, or I take it back. It doesn't work like that. So once the person made it hefker, the way that the commentaries explain the concept, it's like a vow. It's a form of a vow. And therefore, when it comes to a vow, the person can't just say, I changed my mind. Therefore, the owner that gave up ownership of something by simply saying so cannot reclaim it by just saying so. Now, that having been said, im kain if so legoy, the loy nemar loy lo yachel. When it comes to the non-Jew, where we don't find that there's a prohibition against the non-Jew not keeping his vow. Now, we discussed this in a previous class here in the S'dei Chemed, that when it says lo yachel, that's the verse that says that a person is not to make unsacred or unholy or profane his words. Lo yachel dvaroi. When someone said something, when they made a vow, they must keep it. And then there's rules of how the person can undo their vow. Not by simply saying, I changed my mind. They don't have the power to do that anymore. However, that is a commandment. That's one of the 613 for a Jew. We don't find that falls into the general category of the 7. We don't find that the non-Jew is commanded lo yachel, that he should not keep his vow. So therefore, that being said, efsher, it's possible, to yochel achzor. So maybe by the non-Jew, there is this leniency. He does have the verbal power to retract his hefker, his giving up ownership. Unlike the Jew, because by the Jew it's a problem of going against his vow. By the non-Jew, there's no problem of that nature. So therefore the Jew that says, this item of mine is hefker, he can't just come along an hour later and say, hey, nobody claimed it. Okay, it's mine. I just reclaimed it. It doesn't work like that. He has to do the physical act of acquisition, whatever that may be. But by the Ben Noyach, according to what we want to suggest right now, it could work like that. He says, this item of mine is hefker, ownerless. An hour later, nobody claimed it. And then he says, I am reclaiming it. And then, in fact, it becomes his. Ve'ein loymar, and we cannot say then, im kain, if so, the yachoil, lama behefker potter mimaiser. So if that's the case, if he's able to undo his hefker, his giving up ownership, so why then did we just explain that when the non-Jew didn't just give leket shikhan peya in his field, but he actually denounced his ownership, we said, then indeed, you don't have to give meiser, you don't have to tithe it. The problem is, we say in a different place in the Talmud, at the end of the 4th chapter of the Tractate of Nidarim, which deals primarily with vows, that according to the opinion, there's an opinion, that up to 3 days, the person who was mafkir, who gave up ownership, could retract. Up to 3 days. Loi nifter min meiser. So then why does it become exempt from giving the meiser tithe? Hainu im chazar bo mafkir. Meaning, if the person who denounced his ownership retracted, and he did not want to reclaim ownership by doing an act of acquisition. But if he in fact took hold of it legally by doing an act of acquisition, and it came now into the possession of the person who took ownership, nifter meha meiser. So then it becomes exempt from meiser. Now that only works by a Jew. If we're going to say that by a non-Jew, there is no problem of reclaiming what he made Hefker. Al kein din zeh tzarich iyun. Therefore, this ruling and this explanation of the Mishnah in Peya, that if the non-Jew didn't just give away the leket shikhan Peya, but he actually denounced his ownership, then you don't have to give meiser. That needs to be understood. That's difficult. Ad kan loshen shalos teshuvas riva. Up there is a quote. Everything we said here, this entire piece, is a direct quote from the responsa of Riva, which is Rabbeinu Yoel ben Eliezer Ungar, the Soif Simen Zakein, at the end of section or chapter 157. So he's asking, how does that work? Because normally, if a non-Jew gave peya, he left the edge of the field for poor, that does not exempt him from giving meiser. But if he made it hefker, then it does. So he's asking, that shouldn't work that way. Now what I mentioned at the beginning, how this is relevant to the Shemitah sabbatical year. So let me just touch upon it, because it's, at least for the Jewish people, it's relevant, and it's coming up. Shemitah, the sabbatical year, biblically only applies in the land of Israel. And the mitzvah is that we are to let the land rest for this entire year. No working of the land. It's Shabbos, it's Sabbath for the land, for the earth, the land of Israel, for an entire year. 6 years we work, and the 7th rest. Similar to the concept of Shabbos in days, which is a cycle of 7 days. After 7 days, the week begins again. 7th day is the day of rest, and then after that begins again. And weeks are 7 days because of that. So similarly, there's the concept of 6 years, and then the Shemitah year. And then again the cycle begins. Every 7th year is the year of Shemitah. Now, in rabbinic law, they've extended it in many ways. And question is, as far as keeping the laws of Shemitah, which are very detailed and they're very strict. It's a very big prohibition not to keep the Shemitah or to eat from the produce of the Shemitah year. I mean, basically, biblically, every landowner, every farmer who owns a field or an orchard or any type of land has to give up ownership of the produce of the land for that year, which basically means anyone can come and take what they want from anyone's field property during that year. Now, it's not exactly as such, but that's the general idea. There's lots of rules and regulations, but that's basically the idea. Now, what do you do, especially nowadays? So there are different ways to deal with this. Like the farmers need, to make money. People have to survive. So, one way, I'm telling you in practical terms, one way is that during that year, the produce is from non-Jews. It's fields that are growing grain and fruits and vegetables, etc., that are owned by non-Jews. The problem with that is, how in the first place does a non-Jew own land in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel? That's not so simple. How did he get that land? Was it sold to him by a Jew? So that's not so simple. We've mentioned that we can sort of compare this, or it seems so, even though according to what we're saying now you can't, to Passover and Pesach. Not only can a Jew not eat chametz, but he cannot own chametz, anything which is many of the 5 grains, wheat, barley, etc., that came in contact with water, and before it was totally baked, it had risen. That's called chametz, which is forbidden for a Jew to eat or own on Passover. So what do you do with all of the chametz that you have? So, what's been commonly done for many years now is that prior to Passover, the Jew sells his chametz to the non-Jew. And because it's so complicated how to do this properly, the common practice is that the community comes to their local rabbi and they sign a document, etc., and they empower him, they give him what we would call, I guess, legally the power of attorney to do whatever he pleases with their chametz prior to that upcoming Passover. And then, on the day, the eve of Passover, before the deadline of not owning chametz, the rabbi, who's representing many Jews, meets up with a non-Jew, and they go through a whole legal transaction, and he sells all of this chametz, the bakeries, the grocery stores, all of the chametz, to the non-Jew. At the end of Passover, after 8 days, the non-Jew comes back to the rabbi, and he says, I changed my mind. I want you to buy it back. And then the rabbi buys it all back. By doing so, this seemingly, quote unquote, trick works. It's 100% legal if it's done properly. And those Jews did not own chametz on Passover. Okay? Well, when it comes to the Shemitah, sabbatical year, the produce actually is holy. Even though we can eat it, we don't work the land, and anybody can go and just take what he wants and eat it, but it's holy, the produce. And therefore, for example, you can't just peel it and throw the peels in the trash. You can't just throw it in the rubbish bin like you would do any other year, any other time, or outside of the land of Israel. Who thinks twice? If you take a fruit or a vegetable that you need to peel, just throw it in the garbage. No. Not Shemitah. It's a whole discussion. So one way to avoid the transgression is you're taking it from property of the non-Jew. Or what some do, prior to the Shemitah year, just like prior to Passover, we sell the chametz to the non-Jew. They sell the land, the field, to the non-Jew. So now, no problem. Jew doesn't own it. This non-Jew owns it for this year. And then, he's growing the produce, he sells it to us, it doesn't have the sanctity of Shemitah. That's how some do it. And other authorities, scream and yell that doesn't work, and that it's actually a prohibition to sell any property, any land in the land of Israel to a non-Jew, which opens up to a whole other discussion. Even though there it has more ramifications. But as far as giving away land, which has been an ongoing discussion, I would say about 70 years now, or at least since 1967, the trade-off of land, pieces of land of the Jewish people to the enemies for peace, which is a whole discussion and a whole topic for itself. So part of the argument is that you're not allowed to give away or to sell the land of Israel to a non-Jew. Now, parenthetically, obviously, if it's a matter of what we call in Jewish law, pikuach nefesh, which basically means a threat to one's life. So the rule is that with the exception of 3 sins, life pushes away any and every prohibition. If it's a matter of life and death, you do it. So in this case, if giving away land, which is forbidden, would bring true peace, then you would do it anyway. Problem is that we know that it's to the contrary. That giving away land never yet brought any peace, so therefore it's a moot point. But getting back to the Shemitah, some authorities say that it's terrible to rely on this approach of selling the land to the non-Jew for the year of the Shemitah, so therefore it's technically not Shemitah. So really it's a big issue, and that's why at least the Jew needs to be extremely careful with the produce that he eats during this year of Shemitah, and then a little bit into the following year, because it's still the produce from the previous year, of what to do and how to do, and it's really not just good enough if it says kosher. Anyhow, the next piece, Chaf Gimel, which is the bottom of the right-hand column, 23, is getting into the following discussion. Suffix, a doubt. If something is possibly a prohibition, but we don't know for sure. So how does that work for a ben noyach? Can they do it if it might be forbidden and it might not be forbidden? So let's see. Suffix isur. If something is in a category of being in doubt as to whether it is actually prohibited. Im asur livnei noyach oy loy. Nesar lohem. Is it forbidden for the bnei noyach? Or, in such cases, is it not forbidden for them? Elavada yisur. The only things which are forbidden for bnei noyach are definite prohibitions. That's the question. V'loy safek. Only things which are vadai, definite, with certainty, and not doubts. Bein leman da'amar, d'chomer asfekes d'Rabbanan, uvein leman da'amar d'chomer asfekes min ha'Torah. Now, as far as the Jews are concerned, the rule is that if it is a doubt as to whether it is a biblical prohibition or not, we have something which might be biblically forbidden for the Jew or might not be. We don't know. So everyone agrees that it's forbidden. The question is that biblically forbidden or is it rabbinically forbidden in a case where we don't know whether something is really biblically forbidden? So the prohibition, is that rabbinic or biblical? Ein Mashevesi Lil Sifkat and Gimel. So he says, take a look at what I brought down before in subsection 3, which was many classes ago. He's telling us which paragraphs back there. And in the responsa of the book called Shoel U'Meishiv, what I brought on over there, the mashma, that back there, says the S'dei Chemed, we said that it seems implicit that Bnei Noach muzharim ala safek, that Bnei Noach are prohibited to have something which is a doubt. The only difference is they're not put to death if it was only a doubt. If the thing which was prohibited, which he transgressed, was only a doubt, you don't put them to death. But anyway, without that, we have to take note of the words of Maimonides, of the Rambam, in the 10th chapter of the Laws of Kings, law number 8. What does he say over there? Amru Chachamim, that the sages stated, Shebnei Keturah, that the children of Keturah, which was one of the wives of Abraham, besides for Sarah, Shem Zari Shel Avram, the Bnei Keturah, the descendants of Keturah, they are the seed of Abraham. Shebo Achar Yishmo, the Yitzchak. They came after Avraham's two main children, the eldest Yishmael, and then, of course, Yitzchak. Then came a whole bunch of children, the descendants of Keturah. Chayavim b'milah. So the Rambam there rules that the Bnei Keturah are obligated to be circumcised. Have to be circumcised. Because God commanded Abraham that your descendants have to be circumcised. So Yishmael was circumcised at age 13, Yitzchak was circumcised at age 8 days old, and the Bnei Keturah, which came along later, they also need to be circumcised. And continues the Rambam and states, V'hoyel, and since V'nis arvu ayom b'nei Yishmael v'bnei Keturah, since the descendants of Yishmael, which they're not obligated to be circumcised, Yishmael himself, yes, but not his descendants. So since the descendants of Yishmael and the descendants of Keturah got mixed together, they'd all have to be circumcised on the 8th day. But they're not put to death if they don't. That is the end of the quote of the ruling of the Rambam. He says that because there's a doubt, and we don't know who needs to be circumcised at 8 days old, which would be the Bnei Keturah, and who doesn't, which would be the Bnei Yishmael, therefore you just got to do all of them. But you don't put them to death if they don't. Mizen nireh, from this it appears, shebnei noyach isnu b'sfeikos. We have a very pretty clear, implicit ruling of the Rambam that when it comes to a doubt, the Bnei Noach are obligated. They do have to consider the stricter side of the doubt. Umali mitzvah saseh, umali lo saseh. And why should you make a distinction between a positive commandment, such as circumcision, and a negative commandment, such as most of the Bnei Noach mitzvahs? There's no reason, there's no logic to make a distinction if it's biblically forbidden, or if it's a doubt as to maybe this is a case where it's biblically forbidden. It would be the same as the positive commandment of milah, of circumcision. And we need to really think deeply and figure out in this dispute that the most recent rabbis have, aliba de harambam, according to Maimonides, that which we're being strict when it comes to a biblical case, a doubt as to whether it's forbidden, so that we're being strict is only rabbinic. Do we say the same thing when it's a doubt when it comes to a positive commandment? The yesh soivrim, because some say the b'mitzvah say when it comes to a positive commandment that you're in doubt as to whether you need to do it. Moider Rabbeinu du min ha-Torah. There, the Rambam would admit that biblically you have to be strict. Shelafi deo zoy, according to this opinion, ein kol kach echacha l'safik yisurin midivrei Rambam halalu. So there isn't such a strong proof that according to the Rambam, if you're not sure if something is forbidden, if you're not sure if you have to fulfill it, if it's a positive act, and you're not sure, so we say, well, yeah, you have to do it because there's a doubt. That doesn't prove the flip side, that if we're not sure if something is forbidden, that you would for sure biblically have to refrain. Says the S'dei Chemed, at this point I'm just coming to bring to your attention V'ayin b'kunteres yedidi hagoyin avbezdin kilas volutishski yishma mitzvah v'chaskem shevesi b'kunteres zeh b'merchas habeiz ois talud b'mai d'shokil v'tori b'din sofik l'benoyach b'seif katon yudalud v'seif katon chai v'seif katon yutes v'seif katon chav. Then he tells us a whole list. He says, take a look at what my friend, which I quote in my pamphlet, and he gives us a whole bunch of places where there's a whole give and take and discussion back and forth as far as the case of a doubt for a ben noyach, whether he has to be strict about it, whether it's biblically an obligation or not. So again, we don't have any absolute clarity over here. He's bringing to our attention this topic and this subject, that suffix, a doubt, does it apply to a ben noyach or does it not? All right, that brings us to Chaf Dalet on the top left, and we're pretty much out of time for today's class. And in the meantime, wishing everyone the greatest success in studying, observing, promoting, teaching, and educating the 7 mitzvahs b'nei noyach, to make this world the perfect world that it was created to be, with a complete revelation of our righteous Mashiach right now. Thank you.